The old stagecoach bounced and rattled down the dusty trail, throwing Margaret O'Sullivan against the wooden sides with every bump. Her hands gripped the worn leather satchel in her lap, the only thing she had left from her old life. Inside that bag were 3 dresses, a small Bible her mother had given her, and a handful of letters that had changed everything. Those letters were from Silas Brennan, a man she'd never met but who had promised her a new life. Back in Ohio, when the drought killed her crops and the bank threatened to take her farm, those letters had seemed like salvation. Brennan wrote about his successful trading business, his comfortable home, and how he needed a good woman to share his life. His words were kind, respectful, and gave her hope when she had none left. But now, as the stagecoach pulled into Deadwood Creek, Margaret felt a cold knot of worry in her stomach. The town looked nothing like the prosperous settlement Brennan had described. Wooden buildings leaned against each other like drunken men, their paint peeling and their windows cracked. The streets were muddy rivers of horse manure and garbage. Men stood around in dirty clothes, watching the stagecoach with eyes that made Margaret pull her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The driver climbed down and opened the door. "This is it, miss, Deadwood Creek." His voice was gruff but not unkind. "You sure this is where you want to be?" Margaret nodded, though her heart was beating fast. She had spent every penny she had on the journey west. There was no going back now. She stepped down from the coach, her legs shaky from the long ride. The driver handed her the small trunk that held the rest of her belongings, tipped his hat, and climbed back up. Within minutes, the stagecoach was rolling away, leaving her alone on the main street. People stared at her. Women peeked from behind curtains. Men stopped their conversations to look her up and down. Margaret had never felt so out of place. Back in Ohio, she had been somebody. She owned land, ran a small farm, and was respected in her community. Here, she was just another desperate woman who had traveled hundreds of miles to marry a stranger. "You must be Margaret." The voice made her jump. A tall man approached from the direction of the general store. He was older than she had expected, maybe 50, with gray streaks in his brown hair and deep lines around his eyes. His clothes were better than most of the other men in town, but they smelled of whiskey and sweat. "Mr. Brennan?" she asked, hoping her voice didn't shake. "That's right." He looked her over like she was a horse he was thinking about buying. "You're smaller than I expected, and older." Margaret felt her cheeks burn. She was 28, which she had mentioned in her letters. "I'm exactly as I described myself." "Sir," Brennan grunted and picked up her trunk. "Come on, then. Preacher's waiting." The wedding was nothing like Margaret had imagined. The preacher was a thin man with yellowed teeth who rushed through the ceremony like he had somewhere else to be. There were no flowers, no music, no celebration. Just a handful of words that legally bound her to a man she was already starting. To fear, Brennan's house was better than most in town, but it was still a far cry from the comfortable home he had described. The roof leaked in 3 places. The windows were dirty and let in little light. The furniture was rough and homemade. But it was the smell that bothered her most. The whole place reeked of stale alcohol and something else she couldn't identify. "This is your home now," Brennan said, dropping her trunk on the floor. "You'll cook, clean, and do whatever else I tell you. No questions, no complaints, understand?" Margaret nodded, though warning bells were ringing in her head. This wasn't the kind man who had written her those letters. "Of course. I want to be a good wife." "Good." Brennan walked to a cabinet and pulled out a bottle of whiskey. "I've got business to attend to. Get this place cleaned up, and have supper ready when I get back." He left without another word, and Margaret was alone in her new home. She looked around at the dirty dishes, the unwashed clothes, the dust that covered everything. Back in Ohio, she had kept her own house spotless. But that house had been hers? This place felt like a prison. She spent the rest of the day scrubbing floors and washing windows. There was no proper soap, so she made do with what she could find. The pantry was nearly empty, just some old beans and a bit of flour. She managed to make a simple stew and some bread, though she worried it wouldn't be enough to satisfy a man of Brennan's size. When he returned that evening, he was drunker than When he had left, he ate the food she had prepared without comment, then looked around the room with disapproval. "I can see you're going to need training," he said. "Women these days don't know how to keep house properly." Margaret bit her tongue. She had been keeping house since she was 12 years old, but she was smart enough to know that arguing with a drunk man was dangerous. The next few days followed the same pattern. Brennan would leave early to conduct his business, which seemed to involve a lot of drinking and gambling. Margaret would spend the day trying to make the house livable with the few supplies she had. When he returned, he would find fault with everything she had done. "The floor's still dirty," he would say, though Margaret had scrubbed it twice. "The bread's too hard. The stew's too thin. Don't they teach women anything back east?" At first, Margaret tried to please him. She worked harder, cleaned more thoroughly, and stretched their meager supplies to make better meals. But nothing was ever good enough. And slowly, Brennan's criticism turned to something darker. It started with harsh words. He would call her lazy, stupid, worthless. He would compare her to other women in town, always unfavorably. When she tried to defend herself, he would raise his voice and tell her that wives should be seen and not heard. Then came the first time. He raised his hand to her. It happened on a Tuesday morning. Margaret had been in town for 2 weeks, and she was starting to understand that Brennan's business wasn't as successful as he had claimed. Creditors came to the door regularly. The shelves in their pantry grew emptier each day. When she suggested that she might find work to help with expenses, Brennan exploded. "My wife doesn't work," he shouted. "What kind of man would that make me?" "A practical one," Margaret replied, trying to keep her voice calm. "Many women work to help their families." That's when his hand struck her cheek. The sound echoed through the small house, and Margaret stumbled backward, her hand flying to her face. She had never been struck by a man before. The shock was almost worse than the pain. "Don't you ever embarrass me like that again," Brennan said, his voice cold and steady. "You'll do as I say when I say it, or you'll face the consequences?" Margaret stood there, her cheek burning, and realized that she had made a terrible mistake. The man who had written her those kind letters didn't exist. In his place was someone who saw her as property, not as a partner. And she was trapped, hundreds of miles from home, with no money and no way to escape. The town of Deadwood Creek offered no comfort. The people there had their own problems and showed little interest in helping a newcomer. The women she met at the general store were polite but distant. The men looked at her with a mixture of pity and something else that made her uncomfortable. There was one person who seemed different, though, a quiet man who worked as a translator and guide for people traveling through the territory. She had seen him several times at the trading post, always standing a little apart from the others, watching everything with calm, intelligent eyes. He was Lakota, she had heard someone say, and he carried himself with a dignity that impressed her. Their eyes had met once when she was buying supplies, and she had seen something there that gave her hope. Kindness, maybe, or understanding. It was the first time since arriving in Deadwood Creek that she had felt truly seen by another human being, but even that small comfort felt dangerous. If Brennan saw her talking to another man, especially a native man, she knew the consequences would be severe. So she kept her head down, did her work, and tried to survive each day as it came. Little did she know that her quiet suffering had not gone unnoticed, and that the man with the kind eyes was already planning to act when the time was right. The leaves on the few trees around Deadwood Creek had turned brown and started falling. Margaret had been married to Silas Brennan for 3 months now, and each day felt longer than the last. What had started as harsh words and occasional rough treatment had grown into something much worse. She had learned to move quietly through the house, to speak only when spoken to, and to always have an excuse ready for why things weren't perfect. Brennan's business troubles were getting worse. Men would come to the door demanding money he didn't have. She could hear them arguing outside, their voices getting angrier each time. Brennan would come back inside after these visits with his jaw clenched and his hands already forming fists. Margaret had learned to recognize the signs and would try to make herself invisible. The bruises on her arms and back, were easy to hide under her long sleeves and high collar. The townspeople couldn't see those marks, so they could pretend nothing was wrong. But the bruises on her face were harder to explain away. When people asked about the purple mark around her eye or the split lip, she would mumble something about falling down the stairs or walking into a door. Most people accepted these explanations without question. It was easier for them to believe her clumsy stories than to face the truth about what was happening behind closed doors. The sheriff, a heavy man named Coleman who smelled of tobacco and spent most of his time in the saloon, had made it clear that he wasn't interested in domestic disputes. What happens between a man and his wife is their own business. He had told Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house when she had tried to express concern about Margaret's appearance. The law doesn't get involved in family matters. Mrs. Henderson had pursed her lips and said nothing more, but Margaret had seen the worry in her eyes. Still, worry wasn't enough to change anything. Margaret was on her own. The worst part wasn't the physical pain, though that was bad enough. It was the way Brennan was slowly destroying her sense of self. He criticized everything she did, from the way she cooked to the way she walked. He told her she was stupid, worthless, and lucky that anyone would want her. After months of hearing these words every day, Margaret was starting to believe them. She had stopped looking at herself in the cracked mirror that hung in their bedroom. The woman who stared back at her was a stranger with hollow eyes and a defeated expression. Where was the strong, independent woman who had owned her own farm? Where was the person who had once believed she could build a new life for herself? The food situation was getting desperate. Brennan's creditors were demanding payment, and he was drinking away what little money came in. There were days when Margaret had nothing to eat but a few spoonfuls of beans and some stale bread. She had grown thin, her clothes hanging loose on her frame. One morning in late October, Margaret was walking to the general store when she saw a small boy sitting on the steps of the church. He couldn't have been more than 8 years old, and his clothes were too big for his skinny frame. His mother had died of fever the month before, and his father had disappeared, leaving the boy to fend for himself. The boy looked up at her with eyes that reminded her of her younger brother back in Ohio. Without thinking, Margaret reached into her basket and pulled out the only loaf of bread she had. It was supposed to be their dinner, but the child looked so hungry that she couldn't walk past him. "Here," she said softly, handing him the bread. "You need this more than I do." The boy's face lit up with gratitude. "Thank you, ma'am. God bless you." Margaret smiled, the first real smile she had managed in weeks. For a moment she felt like herself again. She had done something good, something that mattered. The warm feeling lasted all the way home, but when Brennan returned that evening and found no bread on the table, her brief happiness turned to terror. "Where's the bread?" he demanded, swaying slightly from drink. Margaret's throat went dry. There wasn't enough flour to make any today." "Don't lie to me." Brennan's voice rose to a shout. "Mrs. Peterson saw you giving bread to that orphan. Boy, you gave away our food." Margaret's heart pounded. "He was hungry, Silas. He's just a child. And what about me?" Brennan stepped closer, his breath hot with whiskey. "What about your husband? You'd rather feed some stranger's brat than take care of your own family? It was just one loaf." "I can make more tomorrow if you can get some flour." "If I can get flour." Brennan's face turned red. "You stupid woman!" "We don't have money for flour." "Because you keep giving everything away." Margaret backed toward the door, but Brennan was faster. His hand grabbed her wrist, squeezing so hard she gasped. "You're going to learn what happens when you steal from me." The beating that followed was worse than any before. Brennan's fists found her ribs, her back, her shoulders. When she fell to the floor, his boots took over. Margaret curled into a ball, trying to protect her head and stomach, but the blows kept coming. She could taste blood in her mouth and feel her left eye swelling shut. "Please," she whispered. "Please stop," but Brennan was lost in his rage. All his failures, all his debts, all his disappointments were being taken out on the woman cowering on his floor. It might have gone on until he killed her, but a loud knock on the door interrupted him. "Brennan, open up." "I know you're in there." It was one of his creditors, a man named Murphy who owned money from a gambling debt. Brennan kicked Margaret one more time, then went to answer the door. Margaret lay on the floor, struggling to breathe, listening to the angry voices outside. When Brennan came back inside, his mood had gotten even worse. Murphy had threatened to take everything they owned if the debt wasn't paid by the end of the week. Brennan had no way to get that kind of money, and his frustration was looking for a target. "This is all your fault," he said, standing over Margaret. "If you weren't such a burden, I could get ahead. But no, I have to feed you and clothe you and put up with your stupid mistakes." Margaret struggled to sit up, her ribs screaming with pain. "I'm sorry. I'll do better, I promise." "You're right, you will." Brennan's voice was cold and deadly. "Because tomorrow you're going to learn what happens when you embarrass me in front of the whole town." That night, Margaret lay in bed staring at the ceiling, afraid to move because every breath hurt. She knew that something had changed. The violence was escalating and she was running out of time. But what could she do? She had no money, no friends, no family within 1,000 miles. The next morning dawned gray and cold. Margaret could barely get out of bed, but she forced herself. To move, she needed to get to the general store before Brennan woke up, to try to trade some of her sewing work for food. Maybe if she could put a decent meal on the table, it would calm his temper. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders to hide the worst of the bruises and stepped outside. The weekly market was setting up in the main street, with farmers and traders laying out their goods. People were already moving about, starting their day. Margaret made it halfway to the store before Brennan's voice boomed across the street. "Margaret, get back here!" She turned to see him standing in their doorway, his face twisted with anger. In his hand was the small sewing kit she had been planning to trade. He had found it and realized what she was trying to do. "You think you can sneak around behind my back?" he shouted, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You think you can steal from me and get away with it?" People stopped what they were doing and stared. Margaret felt her face burning with shame. "Please, Silas, not here, not in front of everyone. Yes, here." Brennan started walking toward her, his heavy boots echoing on the wooden sidewalk. "Everyone needs to see what happens to thieving wives." Margaret looked around desperately. The people watching wore expressions of discomfort, but no one moved to help her. They all took a step back, creating a circle around her and Brennan like she was a dangerous animal. "Please," she whispered one more time, but Brennan was beyond reason. His first blow sent her sprawling in the dirt of the main street, right in front of the whole town. And this time, he didn't plan to stop until everyone knew who was in charge. Margaret closed her eyes and waited for the end, not knowing that across the street, a quiet man with kind eyes was about to change everything. Joseph Crowfeather had been loading supplies onto his horse when Margaret's first scream cut through the morning air. He stopped what he was doing and looked across the street, where a crowd was forming in front of the general store. At first, he thought it might be another fight between drunk miners, something that happened often enough in Deadwood Creek, but then he heard it again. A woman's voice, high and desperate, calling out for mercy. Joseph's hands stilled on the leather straps of his pack. He had heard that sound before, many years ago, when soldiers had come to his village. It was the sound of someone being hurt by someone stronger, someone who couldn't fight back. The group of surveyors he was supposed to guide into the hills that morning were still inside the trading post, arguing about maps and supplies. Joseph had been hired to take them to the gold claims up north, a job that would pay him enough to get through the winter. He should have stayed focused on his work, minded his own business, and left the white people to sort out their own problems. That's what his father would have told him to do. Chief Crowfeather had taught his son to be careful around white settlements, to watch and listen but never get involved in their disputes. "They have their ways and we have ours," the old chief had said. "Sometimes the best way to survive is to be invisible." Joseph had followed that advice for 32 years. He had learned to speak English without an accent, to dress in clothes that wouldn't draw attention, and to keep his opinions to himself. When white men said cruel things about his people, he stayed quiet. When they cheated him in business deals, He walked away. When they looked at him with suspicion or hate, he met their eyes with calm dignity and said nothing. This approach had kept him alive and even allowed him to build a small but steady business as a guide and translator. He knew the territory better than most white men, could track game and find water where others saw only empty land. People needed his skills, even if they didn't always respect the man who provided them, but as he stood there listening to Margaret's cries, Joseph felt something shift inside him. This wasn't about politics or land rights or the complicated history between his people and the white settlers. This was about something simpler and more fundamental. Someone was being hurt, and everyone was just standing around watching. Joseph had seen Margaret around town over the past few months. She always looked tired and scared, with fresh bruises that she tried to hide under her clothes. He had noticed the way she flinched when men raised their voices, the way she kept her head down when she walked through the streets. She reminded him of a wounded animal, always ready to run. The first time their eyes had met at the trading post, Joseph had seen something there that made his chest tighten. It was a look he recognized from his own childhood when white soldiers had destroyed his village and killed his uncle. It was the look of someone who had been broken by cruelty but was still fighting to survive. Now, as her screams grew louder and more desperate, Joseph made a decision that went against everything he had been taught about staying safe in the white world. He set down his pack and started walking toward the crowd. The scene that greeted him in the street was worse than he had imagined. Margaret was on the ground, curled up in a ball, while her husband stood over her with his fists clenched. Brennan was shouting something about theft and disobedience, but his words were slurred with drink and rage. A crowd of townspeople stood in a loose circle around them, watching with the uncomfortable fascination of people who knew they were seeing something wrong but didn't know how to stop it. Joseph pushed through the crowd, his heart pounding. He had faced down angry bears and hostile war parties, but this felt more dangerous. In the wilderness, the rules were clear. Here, he was about to challenge a white man in front of other white people, and that could easily get him killed. "Enough," he said, his voice carrying across the street. Brennan looked up, his face red with exertion and alcohol. "What did you say?" "I said enough." Joseph stepped closer, his movements careful and deliberate. "The woman has had enough," a murmur went through the crowd. Some people stepped back, sensing that the situation was about to become even more complicated. Others leaned forward, curious to see what would happen when a native man challenged a white man's authority over his wife. Brennan straightened up, his hands still clenched into fists. "This is none of your business, Indian. This is between me and my wife. When you bring it into the street, it becomes everyone's business," Joseph replied. His voice was calm, but his eyes never left Brennan's face. "A man who beats a woman in front of the whole town is not acting like a husband. He's acting like a coward." The crowd gasped. In the frontier code of the time, calling a man a coward was one of the worst insults possible. It was the kind of thing that usually led to gunfights and funerals. Brennan's face turned even redder. "You dare call me a coward? You people don't even know what courage is." "I know what it isn't," Joseph said quietly. "It isn't using your fists on someone who can't fight back." While the two men stared at each other, Joseph was also watching Margaret. She had stopped crying and was looking up at him with eyes full of pain and confusion. He could see that she was badly hurt, but she was conscious and aware of what was happening. "Can you stand?" he asked her, his voice gentle. Margaret nodded and started to push herself up from the ground. Her movements were slow and painful, but she managed to get to her feet. Joseph noticed that her left eye was swelling shut and there was blood on her lip. "Stay away from her," Brennan snarled. "She's my wife, and I'll do what I want with her." "No," Joseph said simply, "you won't." The standoff might have continued, but Joseph did something unexpected. Instead of facing Brennan directly, he turned to address the crowd of people who had gathered to watch. "Look at her," he said, his voice carrying to every person in the street. "Look at what this man has done to his wife. Is this the kind of community you want to live in? Is this the kind of behavior you want to accept?" The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some people looked away, ashamed. Others stared at Margaret's bruised face with expressions of horror and guilt. "She's a stranger to most of you," Joseph continued. "She came here looking for a new life, and this is what she found. But every one of you has a mother, a sister, a daughter. How would you feel if this was happening to someone you loved?" An older woman in the crowd started crying. A few men removed their hats and stared at the ground. Joseph could see that his words were having an effect, but he also knew that shame alone wouldn't be enough to change anything. "In my culture," he said, "the strength of a man is measured by how he protects those who cannot protect themselves. A warrior who hurts the weak is not a warrior at all. He's just a bully. Your culture?" Brennan laughed bitterly. "Your people are savages. You don't get to lecture us about civilization." Joseph's jaw tightened, but he didn't rise to the bait. "Maybe that's true, but we don't beat our women in the street while our neighbors watch." "And do nothing," the words hit home. Several people in the crowd looked ashamed, and a few started muttering among themselves. Joseph could see that the mood was shifting, but he also knew that Brennan was getting more dangerous with each passing moment. "You think you can come into our town and tell us how to live?" Brennan's hand moved toward the gun at his hip. "You think you can steal a white man's wife?" "I'm not stealing anything," Joseph said, his voice steady despite the threat. "I'm just asking you to stop hurting her." "And if I don't?" Joseph was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. He knew that whatever he said next would determine not just what happened to Margaret, but what happened to him as well. In a town like Deadwood Creek, a native man who challenged white authority rarely lived to tell about it. But as he looked at Margaret's battered face and then at the crowd of people who had been willing to watch her suffer in silence, Joseph made his choice. "Then I guess we'll find out what kind of man you really are," he said, "and what kind of people they really are." He nodded toward the crowd, and for the first time since the confrontation began, Brennan looked uncertain. He had expected the Indian to back down or run away. Instead, he was being challenged not just physically, but morally, in front of the entire town. The next few minutes would determine everything. The silence in the street stretched like a tight rope about to snap. Everyone could feel something important was happening, but no one knew what would come next. Joseph stood between Margaret and her husband, his calm presence somehow making the angry man look smaller and more pathetic. The crowd had grown larger as word spread through town, and now at least 30 people were watching the confrontation unfold. Margaret wiped blood from her lip with the back of her hand, her whole body shaking from fear and pain. She had never imagined that anyone would stand up for her, especially not a man who barely knew her. In her 3 months in Deadwood Creek, she had learned that people minded their own business and expected others to do the same. But here was Joseph risking his own safety for a stranger. Brennan's hand still hovered near his gun. But Joseph noticed the man's fingers were trembling. Whether from alcohol or fear, it was hard to tell. Joseph had seen this before in men who were used to getting their way through violence. When someone finally stood up to them, they often didn't know what to do next. "You think you're some kind of hero?" Brennan snarled, trying to regain control of the situation. "You think these people care about you or your opinions?" Joseph glanced around at the faces in the crowd. Some looked uncomfortable, others curious, but most seemed to be waiting to see what would happen before deciding which side to take. He knew that in a place like this, people were more likely to follow the strongest voice than the right one. "I'm not a hero," Joseph said quietly. "I'm just a man who can't stand by and watch another person get hurt." "Well, that's real noble of you," Brennan said with a bitter laugh. "But you don't understand how things work here. A man has rights over his wife. That's the law." "The law says you can't beat someone half to death in the street," came a voice from the crowd. Everyone turned to see who had spoken. It was Tom Henderson, the man who ran the general store. He was a quiet fellow who usually kept to himself, but now he was stepping forward with a grim expression on his face. "Tom, stay out of this," Brennan warned. "This is none of your concern." "It became my concern when you dragged it into the middle of my street," Tom replied. "I've got customers who don't want to step over a bleeding woman to buy supplies. A few people in the crowd nodded agreement. Joseph felt a spark of hope. Maybe the townspeople weren't as indifferent as he had thought. She's not bleeding that bad, Brennan said, but his voice lacked conviction. Look at her face, Tom said. Really look at it. Is that what you call not that bad? More people began to speak up. Mrs. Peterson, the boarding house owner, mentioned that she had seen Margaret with bruises before. Old Pete, who delivered mail, said he had heard screaming from the Brennan house on multiple occasions. Even young Billy, who swept floors at the saloon, admitted that he had seen Margaret flinch whenever men raised their voices. Joseph watched this transformation with amazement. These people had been content to ignore Margaret's suffering when it happened, behind closed doors, but now that it was public, they were finally finding their voices. Maybe shame was a more powerful force than he had realized. You've all seen what's been happening, Joseph said, his voice carrying across the street. You've known for months that this woman was being hurt. But you chose to look the other way because it was easier than getting involved? Some people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, but no one denied his words. I understand why, Joseph continued. Getting involved in other people's problems is dangerous. It can bring trouble to your own door. But sometimes staying quiet is more dangerous than speaking up. He gestured toward Margaret, who was still standing despite her injuries. This woman came here looking for a new life. She trusted someone who lied to her, and now she's trapped. But she's not the only one who's trapped. Every time you watch something like this happen and do nothing, you become a little less human. Don't you lecture us about being human, Brennan interrupted. You people scalped children and burned settlements. Some did, Joseph agreed calmly. Just like some of your people have done terrible things too. But we're not talking about what happened in the past. We're talking about what's happening right now, in front of all of us. He turned to face the crowd more directly. I know what it's like to be powerless. I've watched my people suffer and been told there was nothing I could do about it. But today, right here, we do have power. We have the power to decide what kind of community this is going to be. An older woman near the back of the crowd spoke up. What do you want us to do? We can't change the law. I'm not asking you to change the law, Joseph replied. I'm asking you to follow it. The law says you can't beat someone half to death, whether they're your wife or not. The law says every person has the right to be safe in their own community. Sheriff Coleman had been standing at the edge of the crowd, trying to stay invisible. Now Joseph looked directly at him. Sheriff, you took an oath to protect the people of this town. Does that oath include protecting women from their husbands? Coleman's face turned red. The law is complicated when it comes to domestic matters. No, it's not, Joseph said firmly. The law is simple. You can't hurt people. You can't beat them bloody in the street. You can't terrorize them in their own homes. The law is only complicated when you don't want to enforce it. The crowd was getting restless. People were talking among themselves, some agreeing with Joseph, others defending the traditional view that a man's home was his castle. But Margaret could see that something was changing. For the first time since she had arrived in Deadwood Creek, people were actually discussing her situation instead of pretending it didn't exist. Brennan could see it too, and it was making him desperate. He had built his authority on the assumption that no one would challenge him, especially not in public. But now a native man was making him look weak in front of the whole town, and some of the townspeople were starting to agree with the outsider. I've heard enough of this, Brennan said, his hand moving toward his gun. Nobody tells me how to handle my own wife. Then maybe it's time someone did, said a new voice. Everyone turned to see Father Rodriguez, the Catholic priest who served the small church at the end of town. He rarely got involved in community disputes, preferring to tend to spiritual matters rather than earthly ones. But now he was walking through the crowd with a determined expression. In the eyes of God, marriage is about love and protection. The priest said, What I see here is not marriage. It's slavery, and slavery is a sin. This was a powerful statement coming from a man of the cloth. Several people in the crowd crossed themselves or bowed their heads. Even some of Brennan's usual supporters began to look uncertain. Father, you don't understand, Brennan began, but the priest cut him off. I understand perfectly. Father Rodriguez said. "I've seen Margaret at church with bruises she tried to hide. I've heard her pray for strength to endure another day. I've watched her spirit break a little more each week, and I've been a coward for not speaking up sooner." He turned to address the crowd. "We've all been cowards. We've let fear and custom and convenience blind us to what was right in front of us. But it's not too late to do better." Joseph felt the energy in the crowd shifting more strongly now. People were nodding, whispering agreement, looking at Margaret with sympathy instead of indifference. But he also noticed that Brennan was getting more agitated, his hand now resting on his gun handle. "This is my town," Brennan said, his voice rising. "My wife, my business, my rules. And I'm not going to let some Indian and a priest tell me how to live." "It's not your town," Tom Henderson said firmly. "It's our town, and we're telling you that this stops here, today. You think you can make me?" Brennan's voice was getting higher and more desperate. "You think you can gang up on me and force me to do what you want?" Joseph stepped forward slightly, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "No one's ganging up on you. We're just asking you to act like a decent human being. But if you can't do that, then yes, we'll make sure Margaret's safe." "How?" "What are you going to do?" Joseph looked around at the faces in the crowd, seeing determination where there had been indifference just minutes before. "We're going to give her a choice. Something she hasn't had since she got here." He turned to Margaret, who was staring at him with wide eyes. "Ma'am, you don't have to stay here. You don't have to live like this. There are people who will help you leave if that's what you want." Margaret's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Where would I go? I don't have any money." "I don't have anywhere to go." "That's not your problem to solve alone," Joseph said gently. "Sometimes the first step is just deciding that you deserve better than this." For a long moment, Margaret stood. They're looking around at all the faces watching her. For months, she had felt invisible, like her suffering didn't matter to anyone. But now, somehow, her pain had become the center of everyone's attention. People were willing to take risks for her, to challenge authority for her, to stand up for her when she couldn't stand up for herself. She looked at Joseph, whose kind eyes held no judgment, only compassion. Then she looked at the priest, at Tom Henderson, at the other townspeople who had finally found their courage. And finally she looked at her husband, who stood there with his hand on his gun, his face twisted with rage and fear. Margaret's words echoed through the street like a gunshot. "I want to leave. I want to go somewhere safe." For a moment, everyone stood frozen, as if they couldn't believe what they had just heard. Then Brennan's face twisted with rage and something else that looked like panic. "You're not going anywhere," he snarled, his hand tightening on his gun. "You're my wife, and you'll do what I say." But something had changed in Margaret's eyes. For the first time in months, she stood up straight and looked her husband in the face without flinching. "No," she said simply, "I won't." The crowd held its breath. Everyone knew that the next few minutes would determine not just Margaret's fate, but the kind of community Deadwood Creek would become. Would they follow through on their brave words, or would they back down when faced with real danger? Joseph stepped closer to Margaret, positioning himself between her and Brennan. "You heard her," he said quietly. "She's made her choice." "Her choice?" Brennan laughed bitterly. "She doesn't get to choose. The law says a wife belongs to her husband." "Sheriff Coleman, tell them." All eyes turned to the sheriff, who looked like he wished he were anywhere else. Coleman had spent years avoiding difficult decisions, but now he was trapped in front of the entire town with nowhere to hide. "Well," Coleman said slowly, "technically, a woman can't just leave her husband without proper cause." "Proper cause?" Father Rodriguez stepped forward, his voice ringing with indignation. "Look at her face. Look at those bruises. How much more cause does she need?" "The law is the law," Coleman said weakly, but even he didn't sound convinced. "Then maybe the law needs to be challenged," Tom Henderson said firmly. "Maybe it's time we decided what's right instead of what's legal." Joseph nodded in agreement. "Sometimes doing what's right means going against what's written in books. Sometimes it means standing up for what you know in your heart is true." He turned to address the crowd directly. "Every one of you knows this is wrong. You've known it for months. You've seen Margaret get thinner and sadder and more afraid. You've heard the screaming from their house. You've watched her try to hide her bruises. And you've done nothing because you thought it wasn't your business. But today, he continued, you found your voices. You spoke up when it mattered. You chose to see Margaret as a person instead of as property. Don't stop now. Don't let fear make you silent again. Old Pete, the mail carrier, stepped forward. The boy's right. I've been delivering mail for 20 years, and I've never seen a woman look as scared as she does. If she wants to leave, we should help her. And go where? Brennan demanded. She's got no money, no family, nowhere to go. She'd be dead in a week. That's not your concern anymore, Joseph said. And she won't be alone. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. I've got money saved up. Enough to get her on the next stagecoach and pay for a room somewhere safe. Why? Would you do that? Brennan asked, his voice full of suspicion. What do you get out of it? Joseph was quiet for a moment, thinking about his answer. I get to sleep at night knowing I did the right thing. I get to look at myself in the mirror and not feel ashamed. That's enough for me, double quotes, Mrs. Peterson, the boarding house owner, spoke up. I've got some dresses that might fit her. And I know people in Denver who run a place for women who need help. I can write a letter of introduction, Father Rodriguez added. There are good people everywhere, if you know where to look. Margaret listened to this conversation with growing amazement. These people, who had been strangers just hours ago, were now planning her escape and offering their help. She had felt so alone for so long that she had forgotten what it was like to have people care about her welfare. You can't do this, Brennan said, but his voice was losing its power. You can't just take a man's wife away from him. We're not taking her anywhere, Joseph replied. We're giving her the choice to leave. There's a difference. The sheriff won't let you get away with this, Brennan tried again. Everyone looked at Coleman, who shifted uncomfortably under their gaze. The sheriff was a practical man who knew which way the wind was blowing. He could see that the town had turned against Brennan, and he wasn't about to make himself an enemy of the entire community. I suppose, Coleman said carefully, if a woman wants to leave town of her own free will, and people want to help her do it safely, that's not really a crime. Brennan's face went pale. He was losing control of the situation, and everyone could see it. You're all going to regret this, he said, his voice shaking with rage. When she's dead in a ditch somewhere, you'll remember this day. She's already dying here, Joseph said quietly. At least now she has a chance to live. Tom Henderson walked over to his store and came back with a small bag of supplies. Food for the journey, he said, handing it to Margaret. And a little money to help you get started. Other people began offering help. Someone brought a warm coat. Another person offered to write letters to relatives in other towns. Even young Billy, the boy who swept floors at the saloon, emptied his pockets to contribute a few coins. Margaret stood in the middle of it all, tears streaming down her face. But for the first time in months, they were tears of hope instead of despair. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you all. The next stagecoach comes through tomorrow morning, Joseph said. You can stay at Mrs. Peterson's boarding house tonight. You'll be safe there. This isn't over, Brennan said, but his words sounded empty now. He was just one man standing against an entire community that had finally found its conscience. Yes, it is, Joseph replied. It's over for Margaret, and it's over for you too. This town isn't going to tolerate this kind of behavior anymore. As if to prove his point, Tom Henderson stepped forward. Brennan, you're not welcome in my store anymore. Take your business elsewhere. Same here, said the owner of the saloon. We don't serve men who beat women. One by one, other business owners in the crowd made similar declarations. Within minutes, Brennan found himself essentially banned from half the establishments in town. His face cycled through anger, disbelief, and finally, defeat. You think you've won something here? He said, his voice bitter. You think you've saved her? She'd be back within a month, begging me to take her in. Women like her always come back. Maybe some do, Joseph said, but Margaret won't. She's stronger than you think. Stronger than you ever gave her credit for. He turned to Margaret, who was still standing there with tears on her cheeks. "Are you ready to go? Mrs. Peterson can show you to your room." Margaret nodded, but before she left, she did something that surprised everyone. She walked over to Joseph and took his hand in both of hers. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You risked everything for someone you barely knew. Why?" Joseph smiled, and for the first time that day he looked relaxed. "Because a long time ago, my grandfather told me that we're all connected. He said that when we help others, we help ourselves. When we stand up for what's right, we make the whole world a little bit better." He squeezed her hand gently. "Besides, I saw something in your eyes that day at the trading post. I saw someone who wasn't ready to give up. Someone who was still fighting, even when it seemed hopeless. That's the kind of person worth fighting for." Margaret squeezed back, then let go and walked away with Mrs. Peterson as they left. The crowd began to disperse, people talking quietly among themselves about what had just happened. Brennan stood alone in the street, his authority broken, his community turned against him. Joseph watched him for a moment, then picked up his pack and headed toward the trading post. The surveyors were still waiting, and he had a job to do. But as he walked away, Joseph carried with him the knowledge that sometimes standing up for what's right changes everything. Not just for the person you're helping, but for everyone who witnesses the act of courage. 6 months later, Joseph received a letter from Kansas. Margaret had become a teacher in a small farming town, just as she had hoped. She worked with a group of women who helped others escape dangerous situations, and she had never been happier. The letter was short, but it ended with words that Joseph would never forget. "You showed me that one person's courage can change the world. Thank you for reminding me that I was worth saving." Joseph folded the letter carefully and put it in his coat pocket. Then he smiled and went back to work, knowing that somewhere out there, Margaret was living the life she had always deserved. And in Deadwood Creek, the story of the quiet Lakota man who demanded justice had become legend, passed down through generations as a reminder that doing what's right is always worth the risk.